Hey, social work students, welcome to week 4 of Social Work 321. I hope you're enjoying this course. I love teaching it. It's one of my favorites. You have a lot to do this week. I'm going to talk a little bit about chapter 4, even though that was in last week's reading. I feel like there were some concepts we didn't cover completely, so I'd like to go over them. You are assigned to read chapters 5 and 6 for this week. And you might have noticed that we're covering a lot of material pretty quickly early on in the semester. However, we will come back to these chapters. So if you're kind of skimming them, I think that's okay. But this is just some really great material. I'm sure most of you are really eating it up and enjoying it. There's some really important information in here. Some of the material in this book is stuff you will use and every day. And so it's important information to really comprehend and digest. Make it a part of who you are. This textbook, I believe, is something you'll have on your bookcase for years to come and refer back to often. So this week, I have assigned to you a discussion on cultural sensitive communication. This kind of coordinates with some of the material you've already learned in chapter 4, and it brings in some of chapter 6 as well. And we'll talk a little bit about some of these concepts today. You have several supplemental materials that you can go over, which I think will be beneficial to you. I really like that TED Talk on social work and law enforcement. I hope you enjoy that. I think that that's got some fabulous, timely information for some of our current events right now. Social workers are really making a difference in the world out there. And this is a TED Talk given by a social worker who is heading up a police department. And I think that is phenomenal. A social work degree is incredibly versatile. You can use it in a variety of areas. And I know most of you already have plans, and I'm excited for you. I've had several phone calls this week and a lot of really wonderful chats with many of you, and I'm proud of what you're doing. You guys are really doing great. Okay, I wanted to go over some of the concepts in chapter 4. It's all about diversity and difference, human rights, social, economic, and environmental justice. Very, very important concepts to social workers. One of the terms that I think it's really important for you to understand is the term diversity. And I know that that is a term that gets kicked around a lot these days. We hear it often. I just heard a colleague the other day mention that, and this is a science professor, he mentioned that when there's diversity in science, for example, in a biome, for those of you who've taken your Biology 100 class, which I believe is all of you. Anyway, when there's diversity in an environment, a physical environment, it basically is a sign that that's a healthy environment. And I think that's really interesting. So what about in a culture? What about in a social environment? If there is diversity, does that mean there's different ideas floating around, different thoughts, acceptance on many different levels? And so I just think that's really an interesting concept for those of us in the social work field to really understand. Does that mean that there's a more emotionally healthy environment when there's diverse ideas floating around? Maybe. Now, I once heard a study about a family saying that if all the children in a large family grow up to do a similar thing, that's a sign that there was an emotionally healthy environment. Who knows? Yeah. Diversity or similarities. Yeah. Maybe the jury's still out on that. Another very important term from chapter 4 that you're going to want to understand for future quizzes is the notion of intersectionality. And this is the idea that that diversity is rather complex, that people live multiple layered identities. Intersectionality is the idea that we're not just on the surface, okay? We're not just, you don't just take me what you see. There are many different layers of who I am as an individual. And so we need to have that general understanding when we're dealing with clients. If you have an ethical dilemma, let's give you an example. Let's say you have a young woman who has been serving time in prison, and she's she's been she has served prison time. She is on parole and she's living in a halfway house, but she's been kicked out of it for violent behavior. And so you're doing the assessment with this young woman. And if you really understand intersectionality, if you recognize that there's many different layers in this individual, then part of your assessment is going to be asking a series of questions. And perhaps you discover that she's taking a medication that produces violent behavior. And that would be something that would further explain some of what is going on with her. And so we want to have a pretty in-depth understanding of the individuals we work with. When I was practicing social work, the assessments that I did were about 12 pages long, and it would take at least an hour to do these assessments. I usually scheduled an hour and a half for individuals to go through the assessments that I did because of the diversity, the intersectionality, the multiple layers that there are within individuals. Sometimes you can understand, and we've talked about this in Social Work 101, when you understand the birth order of an individual, that helps you understand a little bit more about what motivates them. When we understand maybe religiosity and how that's played a role in their life, that can help us better understand. I know one time I was working with a mom and she introduced herself and her child as that she was the child's mom and that the child was her child. Now, I was later to understand that she was the foster parent and this was her foster child, but she didn't like using that term. She was very protective of this little boy and had told him in private to call her mom and that there was no foster, and I thought that was really beautiful. I felt like that gave me an insight to who this person is when she called her foster son her child. So there's a few more concepts in chapter 4 that I think are rather important. Some of the ways that we come to better understand basically tools that we use to measure the impact of identities that people have. For example, gender. How do we understand gender? There's two primary measures that really help us understand. One is the GDI, and this is the Gender-Related Developmental Index. The Gender Inequality Index is separate from that. And basically, these two terms, these are important for you to understand to help us understand the dimension that we have in gender. This is another one of our layers, isn't it? If you had a client that introduced themselves as a woman, but you were later to discover that this was an individual that was born male, but was transgendered, that would definitely give you an insight to that individual, wouldn't it? So a lot of the textbook talks a lot about the gender inequality issues that we continue to experience in our modern day world. One of the things that I found really interesting in your text is how it discussed in some cultures there's actually a lower density of female, even though men and women, male and female, are pretty equal in terms of how many boys and how many girls are born. In some cultures, some societies, there's actually a higher amount of male population than female population. So what's going on there? That we recognize that there's a systemic gender inequality going on, and so it's reflected in the population. Perhaps their abortions are done more likely when there's a female child than when there's a male child. And so this is definitely evidence that we're still experiencing gender equality in our day. Chapter 4 talks a lot about accepting others and respecting autonomy, recognizing that every individual on the planet has their own unique worldview based on their culture, their subcultures, making sure that we're not bringing our own prejudice, our own sense of privilege into the conversation, that we're doing everything in our power to see things from the individual's point of view. One of the things that I think is really important and comforting to those of us in the social work profession is when there is an ethical dilemma, we always remember that we are standing up for the underdog. We should be the voice for the most vulnerable person in the room. So, or person that is related to the incident that we have before us, the family, the group, whatever. So I had an incident similar that reflected this idea when I was a practicing social worker, in that it was very often that a family would come in and there was kind of a general understanding that one member of the family had less value than others. And this was reflected in how people talked about this individual and how this individual, what their body language was like when the whole family was around. And as you many of you really understand that that kind of scapegoat mentality happens often in families, where one person is kind of blamed for all of the negative things going on within the family, and it becomes part of the culture, the subculture of that family, to blame that person. And so as a social worker, when you identify that, it's very important that you are the voice for that individual, and that you help other members of the family or the unit that you're dealing with recognize the value of that individual, and it can be little things like, wow, I wonder what it's like from their perspective. You can say little things like that, but making sure that you're standing up for the underdog is a big part of what we do. I think it's really interesting that the term privilege has kind of hit the fan with our culture around us, and everybody's talking about privilege. It came from social workers. We were the first people to discuss that. The idea of the backpack of privilege, of white privilege, is something that we've been talking about for the last 30 years, and now everybody's talking about it. And it's very, very interesting, but I hope that all of you are recognizing what your privilege is about, and maybe what your lack of privilege is about. All of us have areas that we might have privilege. There's something in your textbook called heterosexual privilege. Isn't that interesting? There's another term in there about beauty. I can't remember what it was called, but if you kind of fit in with what the culture of your day says is beauty, then guess what? You have a little more privilege. I have this gorgeous daughter-in-law, and she's an awesome individual in every way. My son took her to Europe, and while they were there, they were looking at all of the art, and she came home from that and she said, you know what, I figured out that I'm beautiful. And she always would compare herself with the very thin models of our time, and she's not built that way. She's a strong woman, and she would look at these paintings and recognize that was considered beauty. And she's like, I'm beautiful. And I'm like, yes, you are. That's I found it. Beauty bias or beauty privilege is what your textbook calls it. So people who kind of fit in with what the description of the positive, the idea of what is beautiful, have kind of a certain sense of privilege. But as social workers, we should have a sense of autonomy. We should recognize that every client, everybody that we deal with has a right to their perspective of the world. So chapter 4 gets into human rights, social, economic, and environmental justice, very important concepts as we're working on the macro level in social work. Let's talk a little bit about some of the ideas in chapter 5. You need to understand what your legal obligations are. And in social work especially, we definitely have legal obligations. We want to protect ourselves. Cover your own butt is what my boss would always say to me, because at some point you could be accused of malpractice, and so you need to make sure that you've covered yourself to make sure that if and when that happens, you did everything right. Okay, so what are some of the ways we do that? First of all, we have a statement of confidentiality that we give at the beginning of every single session. And I would just do it very simply. What happens here stays here, unless someone's in danger. And very simple statement of confidentiality. I will not talk about what goes on when you're talking with me. I will not share anything unless someone's in danger. And that means if you're in danger, or if someone that you're close to is in danger. we are required at some times to break that confidentiality. And so we make that statement at the beginning of every session. Sometimes when I was a social worker, actually not sometimes, always, I would make that statement in an assessment and say, you're signing up to take my domestic violence course. You've been court ordered to do it. I need you to know that if I see you around town, and this was when I was living in Elko, Nevada, which is not a very big town, right? If I see you at Walmart, if I see you at a restaurant or something like that, I'm not going to say hi. If you say hi to me, I'll say hi, because that will be kind of the cue that you're okay with acknowledging me to, your girlfriend or wife or whatever, significant other. But if you don't say hi, I'm not going to say hi, because I don't want you to have to explain, oh, that's the therapist that teaches my domestic violence classes, if you don't want to. So that is a prelude to that statement I made at the beginning of every session. What happens here stays here unless someone's in danger. And you can make, you can have a variation on that. But that's one of the things that you do to cover yourself in case of malpractice later on. Another thing that I often did was require clients to sign a contract. Sign something that said, I agree that I'm not going to take my life tonight. If I had evaluated a situation and felt like that there was a serious danger, then I would obviously refer that person to the emergency room. But you don't always need to do that, but you do need to cover yourself. And so sometimes a contract will come into play. On page 163, there's a pretty in-depth list of categorical themes that emerge from reviews of grievances and lawsuits filed against social workers. And these are everything from treatment without consent to professional incompetence to failure to maintain currency with advances in the knowledge base, failure to diagnose, failure to report. So go through these, get familiar with these, recognize what you need to know to cover yourself. I know this chapter feels like law school. And some of you are going to say, well, why don't I just go to law school? I often wished I had when I was practicing social work, because there were some clients that I would be able to better help if I had a law degree. There are some universities out there that offer a combined law and social work degree, which are incredibly valuable. So there's a figure on page 166, which is a triangular figure that talks about what your level of responsibility is. The base of that is the duty to warn and protect. And this stems from a lawsuit that happened years ago in which a social worker did not warn. She had a session with an individual who threatened to take a loved one's life, but did not warn because it wasn't required, but because of this incident, it is now required. So that duty to warn or protect is the most important. It's the base of this triangle. The second is the duty to report, right? So that's very, very important. If it's in the state of Nevada, if there's an incident that happens within family members, then I believe it's reported to the police. If it's an incident that happens outside, I'm sorry, the other way around. If it's outside of family members, then it's reported to the police. If it's within family members, it's reported to Child Protective Services if it's an incident of child abuse. So duty to inform, this is important, and the next level. Duty to maintain confidentiality is the next level. So, obviously ethical dilemma comes into play when you have this duty to report and duty to maintain confidentiality. So you have to kind of weigh which is most important. And looking at the Code of Ethics is very important to help you understand that. Duty to respect privacy, very important. And then the very top of that pyramid is the duty to care. All right. As we get into chapter 6, you are going to start talking about preparing, talking and listening, basic interpersonal skills. And we will talk a little bit more about assessments and protecting yourself, protecting clients and loved ones of clients, and that kind of thing. There's some really wonderful information in here. I look forward to reading your discussion this week. I think this is a really fascinating discussion. And don't hesitate to call, text, or email me if you have any questions or concerns about the class. I look forward to hearing from you.